This group, a marvelous group, has come together, of course, to honor our friend Klaus Offe, and from whom I've learned a lot, and as Micheline said last night, I expect to keep learning in the future. Because Professor Offe and I met more than 3 decades ago when no one was thinking or theorizing or even hallucinating about the problems that were going to be associated with post-communist transitions to democracy. Back then, those are fascinating times, and I can't explain it exactly. Maybe somebody can give me some help on this. I think that understanding the world of the German university in the 70s would shed a lot of light on how 1989 was experienced, filtered, interpreted by German social theory. Anyway, I'll say something about that. But before I met Klaus, I spent a year in Heidelberg, early 70s, and one day I asked a fellow student, I think he just had a date, who was a German, what was he doing, what had he been doing? And he was polishing his English, I guess, and he wanted to show he could master English wordplay. So he said, I just had an appointment, and it was a disappointment. So I remembered that last week because I was thinking about this panel, and which I suppose is meant to be a series of reflections on the disappointments of post-communism's appointment with democracy. The fact that we're discussing this in Berlin is very appropriate because 89 and its aftermath is obviously all around us, a kind of basso continuo in the background everywhere you look. But it also makes you wonder where else in the world is the topic of post-communist transition still a live topic for intellectual debate. So much has happened in the last 23 years. It seems remote in a way, visible through a clutter of intervening traumas. So I wonder how are we thinking about this today? Really, what I want to talk about, even though, of course, obviously, it's a fascinating subject, 1989, for any student of European history. What I want to try to do this morning is talk about some of the disappointments of democracy after communism, not in a systematic way, like Klaus would do, but in the context of what I think you can call, and we heard that this morning already in Klaus's remarks, in the context of a global dissatisfaction with democracy, which is, I think, growing. It can't be compared to the bitter disillusionment with democracy of, say, the Weimar generation, but it's still a disappointment. And I want to stop there for a moment, parenthesis on the word generation, I said Weimar generation, to pose a little question to Klaus and Ulrich and others, Germans here, because, not necessarily to be answered now, but sometime. Because political concepts such as democracy and transition to democracy aren't just vague analytical abstractions that can be understood in different ways. And here Klaus, immediately, he would make one of his typologies, where you could put everything, hot and cold, moist and dry, and so on. But they're ideas with a very different meaning for different generations. And in rereading some of Klaus's wonderful writings for this event, I was struck by a passage he wrote in the late 1990s in a chapter called After the Democratic Revolution, where he wrote this, and I'm going to quote, "For the generation of those who have been too young to be conscious witnesses of the military," he's talking about Germany, "too young to have been the witnesses of the military as well as moral defeat of Nazi barbarism, this peaceful, democratic, and on top of everything else, hardly expected and predicted, revolution of 1989 may well stand out as the happiest political event of our lives." Now, there are two things worth noting about that passage. One, it draws attention to the pluralisms of post-communist transitions. This is, in a way, obvious that there was a specifically German story that wasn't repeated elsewhere, a very particular kind of transition. For many reasons, when Klaus was a child, Germany underwent a process of democratization which was accompanied by military occupation. Military came from abroad. Germans experienced it somewhat as, I don't know, they weren't exactly totally the subjects of this transformation. They were in part, but they were also on the receiving end. And then when he was an adult, in the middle of his life, the West Germans who had undergone that process got into a morally complicated, ambiguous transitional process in which they, in a way, replicated the position of the occupying power, not quite exactly put it that way, but they were more the subjects in an ambiguous way of a transition. So this was a very this idea of transition to democracy here in Germany is a very emotional thing. This isn't just a category. It's a lived experience in a certain way. And I think it's lived differently by different generations. 5 years younger than you, 10 years younger, 5 years older, 10 years is a different thing. And I think that's a very important, when you're talking about categories like democracy, to understand this experiential dimension. Now, I wasn't invited here to ask Klaus questions, so I will say, again, back to my plan of re-examining some disappointments of democratization after communism, and in the context of this global disappointment. Because even though post-communist countries each still retain the traces of their unique histories, I think in a way you can say they've now joined the rest of the world in this sense, that their problems with democracy resemble our problems too, or the problems of the rest of the developed world. Now, it's a very important principle of political theory, which you all know, that if you can't make an argument, you make a distinction. So I'll start with the distinction. And that's different kinds of disappointment, specific and general disappointments. All of us have specific disappointments with our democracies. Coming from the United States, observing this insane primary process, I have a lot of things to say about that. I also lived part of the time in Italy, and you mentioned this already too, that there's a sense that democracy is unable to produce a government that can make rational decisions. So you have to create this technocratic government. That's a very difficult experience, and it's also, I think, relevant for you here because, of course, in Italy, they're saying what the general way of expressing their frustration is that there's a new Herrenvolk from the north that's telling them what to do. And they don't experience that as autonomy, as you can imagine. So this is a difficult time for us as well. I think that's part of the context. Now, already in the 1990s, everyone had stopped being euphoric about, that's one thing Kolakowski said, euphoria doesn't really last long. So it wasn't long before the euphoria about 1989 passed. No one predicted that Hungary was going to end up where it is today in this terrible mess, but everyone already then, transitologists had reconciled themselves to becoming traumatologists. That they were studying the problems produced by this change. And Klaus himself wrote very much about this. This is the peculiarly non-revolutionary nature of these transitions, the absence of an organized counter-elite. There was no counter-elite that overthrew the old regime. It just collapsed, so there was no one to steer the process and so on. It was ungoverned. It was more like drift than directed change. We already knew in the 1990s that when autocracy collapsed, democracy didn't arise like toast coming out of a toaster. Democracy is a tiny spot in human history. So it has enormous preconditions, many preconditions, which that the absence of obstacles, the absence of tyranny, doesn't mean the presence of preconditions of democracy that you just discussed, Micheline. And we already knew that less state doesn't mean more freedom, and so on. So what separates us now from what we were thinking, already our skepticism and our sense of the problems that we already had in the middle 1990s, let's say, or certainly by the late 1990s? Well, many factors have intervened in our view of transition between then and now. And it's not that we have suddenly realized that there are problems we didn't realize then. Among those intervening factors, just to be parochial from my own point of view here for a moment, I think weighs very heavily on the mind of Americans is the freedom agenda of George W. Bush, who was he used the idea of democracy promotion through military occupation as an excuse for invading a country and killing tens of thousands, or who knows what the number, of Iraqis who never harmed a single American. And that was his justification was democracy in some way. Pretext, you could call it a pretext, and it was a pretext, but it wasn't only that. And there's just one thing about it that I think is worth adding here or mentioning, because it shows you that in a way the concept of democracy, the extent to which democracy can be an ideology as well as a concept for analytical purposes. When the Americans went into Iraq, For 2 years, they refused to negotiate with any authority that was not elected. They didn't have this problem in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, they knew all the tribal leaders, the warlords. The CIA had been working with them. They knew their names. They knew how much to pay them. They had no trouble with non-elected authority. They didn't say the only legitimate authority is elected. They didn't say that in Afghanistan. In Iraq, they did. And the consequence was disaster. The belief that historically, absurd belief that the only legitimate authority is elected authority. You can't negotiate with a tribal sheikh, or you can't negotiate with Ali Sistani. It's absurd, but we did that because democracy, in a way, the idea blinded us to this, because the historical obvious fact that some authority isn't democratic. Okay, but more generally. Let's start with the simplest definition. You can come up with lots of them. But very crudely, democracy is a system in which citizens are supposed to control politicians, or somehow. The disappointment with democracy is it doesn't work. So that's the first general point. It doesn't seem to allow us to do that. I have 3 points. It's sort of general and then specific about post-communism. Obviously, first point has to do with stateness. This is something we discussed at length in the 90s. Obviously, if you don't have a state, you can't have a democratic state. There's no reason to try to influence the content of the law if no one obeys the law. So without hierarchy and authority, what does democracy even mean? They also have other kinds of hierarchy. Now, there's a potential problem here, very important problem for democratic theory in general. In the U.S., I think there are something like 20 million, is that possible, government workers. Or let's say, we talk about a government wholly elective. That's the line that was used in the 18th century by the American framers, a government wholly elective. How many members of the government, what percentage of members of the government who make decisions that affect our lives are elected or even influenced by someone who's elected? Small percentage. It's not big. The permanent bureaucracy can easily outwit the temporarily elected political figures, easily. They do this. Sometimes it's very pernicious, like the FBI, historically. But in any case, this relation between a permanent bureaucracy and elected leaders is very complicated. Now, in the post-communist story, there was a particularity. And I thought of this in reading Klaus's writings back then, and since, and also the book that Klaus and Ulrich and Jan wrote together. When the Communist Party collapsed, it isn't quite true that Herrschaft or authority collapsed completely, leaving only Macht. What was left were these orphaned fragments. You had fragmentary institutions of the state that were set off on their own. They were kind of spun off. And they started looking for new authorities. But they had a corporate existence, like the procuracy. You know, Russia, I've been studying Russia more, but you can see there something like Gazprom. Gazprom was the Ministry of Gas. Very, very importantly, interesting example of this is that psychiatric institutions, which were originally used to pump drugs into dissidents and so on, are now for sale. You can go to them if you want to get your mother-in-law out of her apartment. You call this guy, you pay him $10,000, he'll put your mother-in-law in the hospital, because this is an institution that was a state body. The most famous is the space program looking for it, but there are fragments of Herrschaft, and that's not quite mocked, because these are not just private interests. And I think that pluralism of fragments left of orphans of a highly developed state. This is not pre-modern. These are modern bureaucracies, but are fragmented. That is a strong obstacle to democratization, and of course, even to authoritarianism, in fact. So that's one. Second point has to do generally with elections and their power to control. You know, Schumpeter has this funny line. Elections are a snapshot, as you know, what the public wants at a certain moment. And Schumpeter says, you cannot fool all the people all the time, but you can fool enough people long enough to do irreversible damage. So that's like a moment in time. If you can You can make people fear. You can say Saddam Hussein is Al-Qaeda and everyone is confused and they'll vote for you. And then you're the president of the United States and you can do what you want in that kind of system. This is the electoral system. The original selection, has a problem about it because it's a momentary snapshot. The way it's supposed to work is that, okay, the original selection isn't doing much, but people are supposed to be, in power, are supposed to be anticipating the next election. So that's Madison. Elections will create a habitual recollection of your dependence on the people and make you anticipate the moment when their power is to cease and their exercise is to be reviewed. And the problem is that doesn't seem to work that well for a bunch of reasons. The first one, this is what you're saying, the relation between the input of votes and the output of policies seems to be very tenuous for some reasons. Why is that? Now, some of it is just the way we organize our political lives. These politicians, big ones, are people who never touch doorknobs. They go through life. They don't live like us. And John Stuart Mill has a wonderful line which says, finding themselves worshipped by others, they become worshippers of themselves and think themselves entitled to be counted 100 times the value of other people. So there's something about just elevating. And already in Locke, this is true. When you elect someone, you change not just you change their motivations, they change the way they see themselves. It's a very big change. It doesn't, they may represent you, but you're really lifting them into another sphere. That's a kind of a general psychological thing. But more structurally, those in power have all kinds of accountability avoidance techniques, including, of course, control of information, very importantly, asymmetry of information. You can't hold people accountable for things you don't even know they do until 15 years later, which is very common, certainly in foreign policy, very true. And then there's the weakness of the vote as an instrument because of the fact that voters have to evaluate the performance of officials over a number of years on a wide variety of unrelated activities. If I'm a lobbyist, I want you to do one thing, and I will contribute to your campaign. So it's very easy to see if you do it or not. But a voter has to think, like 1,000 actions over several years. It's a very weak form of control, actually, which explains why one person, one vote is not quite an accurate description, and why Ken Galbraith, in his book on 1929, I think it's chapter 5, is titled "In Goldman Sachs We Trust." And that's, still true. It turns out that Goldman Sachs does have more influence on regulatory policy than the voter. This is okay, so that's, but it's even more, I think, more deeper point here, and where I'm going to say something about post-communism, is the idea of a soft landing. Now, one way to define democracy is a system in which parties lose elections or leaders and coalitions lose elections. For that to work, they cannot lose too much. When they look forward to losing too much by an election, by losing power, such as, well, you can think of all kinds of examples where this becomes very brutal, they won't step down. This is this intertemporal bargain, whatever you want to, political scientists can call it that. But you reduce the stakes in the election, you reduce what you lose, you reduce what the others win. That already produces a kind of disappointment. But the way it normally works is those who lose will not be, of course, criminally charged. They won't lose their property. I mean, that's one of the main things. They're not going to have their property taken away. Now, that's obviously a problem under post-communism because the memory exists, and it's not just memory, you can see the way property was accumulated. There's a kind of bitterness that property was distributed. Forget about property rights. How was property distributed? Right there, you can see it. There's a bitterness about it. It's so unfair. There was no norm of justice, and there was no democratic process that governed it. So this soft landing for ousted incumbents, those who lose, if you protect the sphere of all of their ill-gotten gains, it's going to produce a sense of dissatisfaction that is, I think, even more acute than the kind of dissatisfaction we have in developed democracies. Third, finally, this is a little bit, I'm not quite sure, Mon and I have been talking about this problem, but it occurred to me, looking at the U.S., we have 12 million immigrants, and I'm wondering if those who have the vote don't have jobs, and those who have the jobs don't have the vote. What does that do to a democracy? Or isn't there some relation between, more broadly, different kinds of leverage that the mass of citizens can have over politicians, which come from things that happen, let's say, between elections or beyond elections? The citizen voter, this would be a theoretical claim, is only able to able to use leverage against the political and economic elite if he's also has other roles: citizen voter, citizen soldier, citizen worker, citizen consumer. So if there are other ways in which the elite needs ordinary people, needs to treat them well, needs them to have money in their pocket, let's say, to buy products created for domestic consumption, that's a context in which the vote has more power. Now, thinking about, of course, Ivan and I have been working on the Russian case here, and there you have an extreme version of this, of a kind of relation between elite and mass, which I think is maybe historically new and is what you can call the result of this movement for the liberation of the rich and the unraveling of a social contract, where you don't need, some of this is true for the US. You don't need soldiers, you have volunteer army, high-tech weapons. You don't need workers because you have slaves in China being beaten up by the People's Republican Army, who are 2 million jobs exported. You don't really need your workers. You don't need to compromise with them, so they have no leverage over you. In the Russian case, you have this extreme thing where you're becoming rich by selling to foreign consumers, so you don't even need domestic consumers to have money in their pocket. You have that's a very, you don't repress people, you don't exploit the workers. You just live in a bubble of detachment, which you can call globalization for the 1%. I think there is a way in which that Russian hydrocarbon princes have a parallel in the American high finance, Wall Street gamblers who seem to feel like they owe nothing to society and don't really need to compromise with it. It comes out in various ways, such as attacking school teachers, because you don't need the young. I'll get back in this a minute. You don't really need the rest of society. In Klaus's book with Ulrich and Jan, he says, in between the crumbling of the old and the new and so on, it wasn't voice but exit that reigned. And I think this is an important aspect. Globalization is better for some people than for others. And it is a class. People who live near airports, for example, people who speak English, like all of you. It's very hard to understand if a hovercraft elite created in these new conditions without these kinds of dependencies can be controlled democratically. This is a little bit about the international context. Exit means openness. The real change from communism wasn't autocratic, democratic, real. Okay, the one I'd emphasize, not autocratic, democratic, not command economy, market economy, but closed to open. Closed to open, that's a huge change, a very big change. And a chance to exploit those opportunities fell very asymmetrically in the societies. Okay, so what I think the most worrying thing is that democracy has other functions besides allowing citizens to control politicians. And one of the worries is that it's lost those capabilities as well. Democracy, voting is a way of, dealing with extremism. It's a way a society paints a portrait of itself so you can see, every faction can see that it doesn't deserve to win 100% of the time. That's a Mill idea. But there's also a way, I think very importantly, in which democracy isn't just about the future. So you talked about order, Klaus, but it's also about creating a future, a sense of a future. I realized this in the elections. I was just in Moscow during the elections, and there were signs in the demonstrations after Putin was elected again, Des svidaniya budishe, goodbye future. There was a sense, okay, so part of what democracy does, seems to me one of its things, that really deep things, and this tells you about the relation between private personal freedom and political freedom, political democracy. Those things, how are they related? One big question is, how is it personal freedom and political freedom related? Those kids who were demonstrating were personally free. They had, there was an American poll once, when do you feel most free? When I get in my car. So they had cars. They could get in their car. They were free personally. They could leave the country. They had money in their pocket. They were angry. They were upset, very upset, about this sense that there was no future because there was no way around Putin. He was standing there. There is no future without me. So one of the things that democracy does, democracy is about promising and disappointing. Whoever's ruling is disappointing you, for sure, but you can always imagine that the next people coming along are going to be better, even though maybe they aren't ever too much better. That's creating a sense of future. And it affects society. It creates an effervescence in society because you don't feel blocked in the way those kids they felt so blocked that they said, okay, we're going to have to leave the country. We're going to have to go to a place where we think there might be a future. The question is, can it do that now? Can democracy, our kinds of democracies, create a sense of the future? And I really worry about this because of the sense of anxiety. In the US, at least, a lot of the emotion in this political campaign is from people who are afraid of change. Obama represents the multiracial America that is already here and is coming even more. They're afraid of it. They want to freeze it. They want to stop it. They can't deal with that kind of future. This is the relation between demography and democracy. Can the democratic system really accommodate, even though it represents demography at one moment, can it accommodate the change? Or is it going to be a vehicle for trying somehow futilely resist it and freeze? I don't know, maybe after the Cold War, which was a battle between different conceptions of the future, we just kind of gave up on the idea that there was a future. I'm not sure. And in Europe, too, you hear these European leaders, they say, we have to buy time. Buy time. That means just do one thing at a time without a concept of where they're going. What is the future? What are we doing here? Where are we going? And it has to be, as Klaus said, that democracy must be about having projects that we can together come up with. Instead of feeling trapped by the situation where you can change rulers, but you don't change policies, or you don't come up with anything new. So again, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but I think that's a very deep, I end with that question. Can democracy, even if it can't very well help citizens control politicians, can it now, in our context, with all our sense of the future seems primarily one of fear, anxiety, global warming, demographic change, so on. Can democracy help us create a more positive sense of the future? Thank you.